Good afternoon and welcome to you all for our Lighten Our Darkness webinar. I'm Jo Penberthy. I'm the Bishop of St David's in the Church in Wales, and I hold responsibility on the bench of bishops for the Church and Society portfolio. In September last year, in fact, the last time our governing body of the Church in Wales was able to meet in person, we held a debate about this very issue, about modern slavery. And it culminated in a motion committing ourselves to exploring every opportunity to play our part in combating modern slavery, including its prevention, detection, and support for its victims. We were very enheartened to see that the debate revealed no lack of knowledge about the problem. Member after member of governing body described incidents or concerns in their own communities, ranging from suspicions about car washes, nail bars and other casual labour, and to the criminal exploitation of children and young people in drug trafficking. As a church with a long-standing commitment to fair trade, we also noted the lack of international regulation and enforcement, which makes it possible for child labour and other exploitative practices to be implicated in our supply chains. In fact, there was even criticism of the proposed GB motion for being too weak. Why were we merely deploring the incidents of slavery, lamenting our failure to end it, and commending government and international efforts, praying for and supporting all efforts to bring it to an end? As part of our work since, we've encouraged members of the Church in Wales, whether they're clergy or laity, to involve themselves in local or national partnerships, which are intended both to drive and monitor anti-slavery activity. We've circulated awareness-raising materials, and modern slavery is included in all aspects of our safeguarding training and highlighted in our statement on the website. Just before lockdown, we managed to run an in-service training day for clergy and lay ministers in the Llandaff diocese in the Cardiff and Valleys area, to consider a range of practical and spiritual ways in which we as church can contribute to the fight against modern slavery. Churches and community groups in different parts of Wales have tried to establish support for victims, from offering premises as reception centres when crimes are uncovered, to setting up friendship groups for victims cared for under the national referral mechanism. Through all this, we've become increasingly concerned that the statutory systems and mechanisms are not working well. Victim care is complicated, fragmented across different organisations in the public and voluntary sector, and it seems difficult for agencies not already holding government contracts to offer additional help, although the need for that is clear. The numerous committees and partnerships across Wales overseeing responses to modern slavery seem complex and cumbersome, and it's difficult to see exactly who is accountable. Questions about the number of victims identified in Wales and what happens to them have repeatedly gone unanswered from both the statutory bodies and the voluntary agencies involved. Meanwhile, we know that the number of prosecutions and convictions of perpetrators is pitifully small, and an increasing number of suspected victims are being held in limbo while their status is assessed. According to the latest report of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner for Britain, by the end of 2019, more than 12,000 people were awaiting a decision about their status as slavery victims. At the time of our governing body debate last September, figures showed that some people referred to the NRM had been waiting for a conclusive grounds decision since 2013. Here in Wales in 2019, 149 adults and 174 children were found in circumstances of suspected slavery. And of the 97 identified in North Wales, 85 are still awaiting a conclusive grounds decision. Our partners have been asking questions, but have still been able to obtain figures for South Wales. In the same year, there were no convictions of perpetrators for the offence of modern slavery in Wales. These are the sorts of concerns which have led us to focus in this webinar on the deeper problems driving the continuation of this crime against humanity in Wales, in Britain, and across the world. Victims of slavery, children, young women and men from war-torn and poverty-stricken parts of the world, adults with learning disabilities, are the most vulnerable people in our world today, deceived into situations where they are mistreated, despised and invisible. They are exactly the kind of people Jesus had in mind when he taught that whatever you do to the least of these, my sisters and brothers, you do to me. It's the church's duty to be involved and to shine a light on the problem of modern slavery, not just in rescuing its victims, but in challenging the systems and structures that allow it to continue. And so we're immensely pleased and grateful that we have here a panel of international experts and an audience of about 150 people, many of whom have already sent in questions and comments. And I'm delighted today that our discussion today will be facilitated by journalist, radio producer and director of worldwatchmonitor.org. So now I hand over to Julia Bicknell, who will chair our discussion. Julia.
Thank you very much, Bishop Joanna. And without more ado, having heard all those sobering facts and figures, I'd like to ask the Right Reverend Dr. Alastair Redfern, who used to be the Bishop of Derby until 2018 and who helped to found the Church of England's CLUA initiative, whose strapline is mobilising the church to help end modern slavery. I'm going to ask you, Bishop Alastair, to give us a theological reflection first about why we should be concerned about this issue anyway, given there's so much else on our minds and so much else to care about and get involved with. Why this issue of human slavery? Over to you, Bishop.
Thank you very much, Julia. And thank you, Bishop Joanna, for your introduction. As I speak, modern slavery is increasing. We're losing the battle. That's one of the things about the urgency. In terms of the theological framework, we believe as people of faith, as Christians, that everybody is created in the image of God. There's a basic preciousness and equality between us all and with us all. Yet, of course, there's always been inequality throughout history. It's rife in the Bible. And slavery is the sharp end of inequality. It's brutal inequality. There's been slavery, of course. The Arabs had a huge slave industry, the Greeks, the Romans, there was slavery in the Middle Ages. We've all been reminded recently about the transatlantic slave trade. All of those forms of slavery were in the public domain. People had slaves quite naturally according to their understanding of life. Many Christians were slave owners. Many of the first presidents of the United States of America were slave owners. Since then, of course, with reforms in the 19th and 20th century, we now aspire to have much more liberal values of everybody's equal, everybody has rights, everybody is precious. We have those kind of laws and aspirations. And that means this brutal exploitation of brothers and sisters, which is slavery, has gone underground. And the strapline of the CLUA initiative, which I work for, one of them is, we see you. Because slavery works, because criminals exploit more and more of the vulnerable people who are desperate, and there are going to be many more of them after this crisis of COVID, and take advantage of them. They're very skilled at recruiting vulnerable people who can be easily dominated and enslave them in the most brutal ways, as we'll probably hear about later. Now, if we're thinking of a theological frame for our response to this fact that more and more people are being driven into slavery, we see you. Jesus begins the gospel in Luke 4 with that sermon, I've come to bring good news to the poor and the oppressed. I'm going to notice those people and include them. He begins his ministry with that manifesto. He ends it in Matthew 25. He summarizes his whole thing by saying, if you've made any response to what I'm about, it can be shown and measured by when you fed me when I was hungry, you freed me when I was oppressed, you gave me a drink when I was thirsty. We see you noticing those in whom the image of God is defaced and crippled, reaching out to them and drawing them in and including them in the fullness of society. That's what the Christian gospel is about, it seems to me. And all our singing of hymns and praying and doing church and synods and governing bodies or whatever we do, all that will be measured between those two bookends of the gospel. Did we give good news to the poor? And when people, brothers and sisters, have the image of God in them defaced and crippled, Did we notice? Did we see? Did we reach out? And did we challenge, as Bishop Joanna said, the systems which on our behalf should be trying to get rid of this wicked and evil crime? The Pope talks about the globalization of indifference. We become so self-centered that not only do we just live in our own Facebook page, our own small group, our own prayer group, we don't only not notice other people, we don't even care about them. We don't think, who provided that cheap t-shirt? How can somebody wash my car for £3? We just have it done and we rejoice because we want the bargain. The theological language is, we're enslaved to sin. We're enslaved to ourself. The great word of today is pleasure. What can I enjoy? The theology of the New Testament in Jesus and Paul is we shouldn't be enslaved to sin and self. We should be slaves to God. Paul 3 times says, I'm a slave of Christ. We need to give our wholeness, our every effort to be slaves to God's purpose, God's kingdom, which is measured by noticing and reaching out to those who are suffering. We see you is the way that theology is turned into practice and life and hope and good news for the poor. We need to say, we see you when we get cheap goods. Who's going to take the time and effort to send an email to the company and ask a question? How can this bargain be so good? Companies are frightened to death of consumer power. Christians need to go that extra mile. We see you in car washes, nail bars. Just go and ask a question. Law enforcement cannot work today without the intelligence of the public. But when we launched our car wash app, the public said, oh, that's the police's job. The police can't monitor all these pop-up car washes. We got to make the effort to notice, to ask the questions, and somebody will check out whether it's a legitimate business or not. We see you. We've got to help local authorities get the capacity of people, of resources beyond the ones that they're struggling to use, to reach out and care for victims, provide facilities, bags of goodies for people, all kinds of small things that make a difference, and say, we see you in the image of God to people who are suffering. There's a massively strange silence amongst Christian people about our neighbour who we cannot see. We're fine if something's in our face, there's a disaster, we all put our hands in our pockets and we make a response. The gospel's about getting beneath the surface of what's going on. Criminals work, and it works for them because all this is beneath the surface, it's hidden. And there's a deafening silence, I think, amongst Christian people about slavery, about sexual exploitation, about children being a moral stop, about consumers just getting a good deal and not wondering where it comes from, about citizens claiming our rights and not being concerned for the rights of those who nobody sees and notices and who are right at the bottom of the heap. So I would invite us to think about a gospel that is measured by our response to modern slavery. That's the measure of our times, I think, as simple as that. I say that to provoke you. We need to learn to say, Lord, with you, we see you. We see you in those brothers and sisters where your image is damaged, oppressed and exploited, and we're going to do something about it. That's my 8 minutes. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Alastair. Now, I'd like to do a quick personal intro to our next speaker, Commissioner Christine McMillan of the Salvation Army in Canada. For several years, hers was a name that I used to see mentioned quite a bit on emails and newsletters, but I had no idea who she was or where she was in the world. And then last May, I finally met her in a conference, and I have to say she's exceeded all my expectations of someone who's bringing change to the world. Some of you may know the Salvation Army is playing a key, strong social justice role here in Europe, and Christine founded its International Social Justice Commission. And as you've probably seen on your agenda, Christine now chairs the Global Human Trafficking Task Force of the World Evangelical Alliance. And so I'm delighted that she's able to join us today to give us her global perspective. Thank you, Christine.
I am now unmuted. You can hear my voice, and it's not a voice that necessarily is from Wales. I am a Canadian living in Canada, but have lived in the UK in my wonderful time there with the Salvation Army. But as I think about this time together, I was on a call at 5 a.m. this morning. And if I was to look out the window, it was completely black, completely dark. I am not in my own home. I'm in the home of the company of someone who has graciously had me come 125 miles away from my home to see all of fall colors of the Canadian trees. And as you look at my face, you perhaps see the sun shining on one side and darkness a little bit on the other. As I think about this webinar together, we are full participants when we understand we share in some light, some knowledge, but we also have some questions about the darkness. And the greatest way in which we can learn and expose human trafficking is to understand light and darkness at the same time. If this was a webinar hosted by traffickers themselves, they would do everything in their own self-interest to ask as many questions as they could to get to the roots of how they as traffickers could be more successful. So what are the questions we can be asking ourselves today? Well, a question I always ask with this topic is, what is human about trafficking? And can I suggest to you, it's human because in some ways it fails or it undermines in all of us those unmet relationships. The trafficker wants to make more money, unmet needs of economy in his life. The victim is enticed to enter into what they think will be a better lifestyle. It is a crime of people. It's not a crime of drugs. It's not a virus. It is not a natural disaster. And it is, above all, what is human about trafficking? It is absolutely inhumane. It requires human intervention, like these webinars, and that requires all of us to ask some deeper questions. And so we live in darkness on many issues. And what are our bold questions going to be about that side of us that longs to know more as a community, as a nation, as a global world? I'm interested in what Bishop Redfern said about Matthew 25, because Matthew 25 is actually a judgment on the nations of the world. How do we advocate before parliaments, before our governance of our nations? They are already in scripture as being judged, the sheep of justice and the goats of injustice. And another question is, what prevents us from believing in collaboration, from taking all of the voices on this call and going to work, and to go to work with an intent of unity being the greatest weapon against trafficking itself? As the leader of the Salvation Army in Canada in my lifetime at one point, I was interested in the fact that we always raised money from our women's ministries for another nation. In this case, it was going to be the nation of Mexico, and trafficking was the issue. This was the situation. Limos would come across the border from California into Tijuana in the night hours and pick up kids who were walking the streets because their mothers were having to work the night shift. And it was thought by the Salvation Army in Mexico and others that we needed to build an institution to house these women and children. And it would mean that the mothers would have to leave their homes with their children as they knew it. It might even mean they had to leave their night shifts. And we began to think about this, and suddenly I struck an idea. We don't need to institutionalize the potential victims of trafficking. And what we came up with, we decided that the best way to address this issue was to start not daycare, but night care. And who did that involve? It involved the fact that children could safely be again under the home of what they knew and their community. It meant that mothers could still go to work on their night shifts. It meant that NGOs and the faith communities didn't have to spend so much money on building a facility that would only take so many and serve so many at the same time. It meant that we could go to the border patrol between nations and challenge that border patrol about those limos that were coming in. Looking at the business side of it, it meant that we had to engage with two governments, the government of Mexico, the government of the US, on protocols. And so we begin to see that our responses, when we work together, when we understand the perspectives from a variety of stakeholders, we come up with solutions that are not institutionalized in our own way, but become a community collaborative effort. When we think about trafficking, it needs to understand a changing market. And some of you have asked questions around COVID-19. And so I've provided some tip sheets on the economic injustices that are being raised because of COVID. But those tip sheets, particularly addressing what it means for traffickers to become more creative when they're more challenged. And so I say, in my 8 minutes that's coming to a conclusion, St. Augustine had a wonderful, wonderful statement. He said, it is one thing to remove a spear from a wound, but quite another for the wound to heal completely. So what are the spears that we're dealing with? What are those issues that create spears in the first place? And where are the threats? And what is it for a community to understand that healing is not just getting someone out of the darkness of captivity, but into the light of their own soul inspiration that they're valuable. And that means prevention. When we think about victims of trafficking, there's no amount of intervention that takes away from their own experience. Awareness is not enough. Unmet relationships don't just apply to those victims of traffickers. It applies to us. How can we meet each other at a table wide enough and big enough that we understand it takes all of the community, the government, the NGOs, the church, to groom ourselves to be truly those who intervene with umbrella networks, with a human potential that doesn't hide itself under a bushel, but raises itself up to be light shining in every dark corner. So thank you. And as I conclude, I want to share with you the fact as well that researchers are looking at the whole way in which faith can be a key and integrate voice. And I'm very pleased to continue this conversation on a recent research project on faith communities that I'm involved in, that we're going to pilot. Let's see what we can do about that as well. God bless you, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Christine. That's great. And now from the global to the local, and Pam Cheesley-Hollinshead. Pam is the joint regional president of Soroptimist International for Cheshire, North Wales and the Wirral. Now, for those of you who've heard the name Soroptimists but may not know too much about them, they're a worldwide volunteer service for women who work to improve the lives of women and girls, both in their local communities and also globally. And it has consultative status as an NGO at the UN, which means that it can make representations on issues it knows about and wants to see change. And although founded in the US, I've checked, and I hope this is still current, Pam, that your international headquarters is in fact in Cambridge. And Pam, you have a PowerPoint, I believe, that you're going to share with us.
I have.
So I'd like to do the necessary. Hopefully that will work.
I hope so.
Thanks.
Right. Did that work? Did that work? No? Yes? Right. Can you see that? Good.
Pam, I think you need to maximize your PowerPoint screen.
Is that better? Right.
Yeah, and maybe put it onto slideshow and from the beginning. Sorry.
Oh, I've not done this before.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. That's it.
Oh, now I've lost my notes. Hang on a minute. While I'm desperately trying to find out what I've done with the notes.
Shall I fill for you and just say thank you so much to Christine for that very practical example from your border experience and how you brought together the government and the NGOs and charities working locally, because I think that's why we're here today. We know what the issues are. It's actually how we mobilize ourselves, just as the Clure Initiative strapline is. So I'm hoping that as people are listening, you're already thinking of ways that you can apply these examples to your own situation, and hopefully we can discuss those. How are you doing, Pam? Are you?
I think I'm getting there. Yes, let's go for it.
Go for it.
Thank you. So, as we all know, throughout the world today, there are over 40 million men and women and children. And it's something that optimists from every continent have been speaking out and raising awareness about for many years. We support the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly 8.7 written by Kevin. They are stark goals because we're running out of time. Governments have let us down. The system is not fit for purpose. And as Christine has just said, it's up to us to be those who push for change. Forgive the initials, I ran out of space, but modern day slavery is that crime for which we want to see people in power, senior people, pay the penalties. Why should they live a life of, not the proverbial Riley, but on the backs of other people's suffering? What's that got to do with a small group in North Wales, Cheshire and the Wirral? We took a decision during lockdown that we felt we just had to do something. The fact that we couldn't meet together and was, I think of all of us, we were struggling with it. So we identified some campaigns, and we wanted to question responsibility and question accountability of what was happening in our own country, our own area. Two excellent initiatives came from this. Project Glasshouse goes back to those in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. So we needed to find out what was happening. If we were going to be spending money in the supermarkets, what were we buying? And did we have to buy those? So some people looked at various products like tomatoes and cocoa. One particular club looked at that cobalt and mica, which can be found in makeup, in car colours, in mobile phones. Do we need those things? So as it said, a lot of letters were written. This is something I'm happy to share if people want to know later. This is how we put together how a club could go about doing what we'd asked them. So do your research, share the information, select the product that you're going to choose to research, ask people in your own environment, do they buy this product? Do they know where it comes from? And then decide what you're going to do at a local and personal local and personal level. Lots of letters were written. A lot of emails were sent. And then, yes, what did we achieve? I'll come to that at the end. But did we take the money away from a merchant? Did we persuade an individual to make that change? Basically, did we inspire others? One club had a lady who is a doctor within that, and she picked up the fact that PPE was being made abroad in poor circumstances. And Llandudno District Club have worked hard, very hard, to raise this issue. It's an ongoing thing now. That club is taking it further, and they are determined to get answers from government and NHS, I suppose. So we sent out letters to statutory agencies and to NGOs so that we could be informed. We work as optimists under the 3 E's: educate, empower and enable. And if we are educated, then we can empower and enable other people. And we wrote to these organisations. Interestingly, as I said to Julia earlier today, I felt very much that the police and crime commissioners, the chief constables, MPs and members of Senate, there was ducking and diving going on. There were no sensible answers. There were no definitive answers. Doesn't do a group of determined women any good to be told, oh, go away. So what are the results of the actions? We have educated ourselves on this matter and can now speak more knowledgeably. We have challenged those in authority, making them aware that systems must be enforced. Bishop Joanna, you mentioned that too. No longer can these figures be fudged, because they're not figures, they're people. They're someone's child, they're someone's mum, dad, even grandparents. This isn't just children, it's everybody, every age group. And another result, we are determined to continue to lobby MPs within England, MSs within Wales. We have got to change and make an impact. I've lost count of time, but that's what we did.
You're okay for time. Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll come back to you with lots of questions afterwards, Pam, as well. But thank you. That's a really good, helpful overview. I really appreciate the time you've put into that PowerPoint as well. And you've already had some requests that people would like you to share that. So hopefully we can do that with Ali Usuri's help at the end. Yeah. Great. And now we turn to Kevin Hyland, last but not least, I would say. Many of you will probably recognise Kevin's name. He was often on the media when he was the first independent anti-slavery commissioner, sometimes known as the Tsar on anti-slavery and human trafficking. Since leaving that formal government-appointed role, he's developing a new strategy around the issues of human trafficking and exploitation throughout the world. And because of his great experience over some years, he's actually focusing on looking at the issue in a very different way to most anti-slavery professionals and NGOs. So I'm delighted to hand over to you, Kevin. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you for the invite to speak today. I'm here in Ireland, and it's great to speak with so many people in Wales and the UK and across the world. But today, when we're here talking about modern slavery, one of the things I want to remember at this time is there are people who are joining us who are on the front line, and it's their work that's making a difference, and we need to recognise those in everything that we do. But across the world, we have many different rules and regulations, from the UN to local, to the EU, to the OSCE, and on and on. But sadly, this crime is still a reality, where it is affecting 40 million people, as we've heard, and we have 151 million children who are in some form of exploitative labour. But we have all this legislation, we have all this policy, yet nothing seems to be changing. And as Bishop Alastair said, we are seeing this get worse and we are losing this fight. And in the UK, we have a Modern Slavery Act, and Bishop Alastair was one of the people in the House of Lords who brought this act together. An incredible piece of legislation, I think well thought out. But this crime exists while there is 150 billion US dollars being generated each year. And our law allows for sentences of up to life imprisonment for committing these fines, these offences. It allows for risk and prevention orders before a crime has even been committed. It allows for proceeds of crime to be taken, and it allows for monies to be given to victims even before a proceeds of crime hearing happens after a conviction. It also allows for companies, provides the companies to supply chain statements if they operate at over 36 million. There's a statutory defence for certain conditions for victims, similar to duress, although slightly different, but that's not unique to this crime, or we may think it is. There is an anti-slavery commissioner, which I was before, and this makes it a lifestyle offence, which actually means that people can have assets taken from them that they've generated in the last 6 years. But as we heard from Bishop Joanna, things aren't that rosy. And if we look at statistics of what's called the National Referral Mechanism, the government-funded project, in last year's accounting, 10,600 victims referred into that, which is positive, we would think. But of that, only 780 were positively identified as victims of trafficking. And when you add up the backlog from previous years, it meant we went into 2020 with a greater number awaiting a decision than those who had gone through the system. And in 2020, the first 6 months of the year has added between 2,000 and 3,000 and possibly more to that waiting list, as only 1,500 of the 4,500 have had a decision made. So these are people, they're lost in a system, the system doesn't know where they are, so frankly then, it's not a system. And if we look at this internationally, we see that actually internationally we're not doing too well either. Of victims identified across the world, the 118 or 119,000 only represents less than 0.5% of the 40 million. And the convictions at 9,548 is woefully low, with only 498 across the entire world for forced labour. And if you look, prosecution numbers are going down, which means that convictions in coming years will also go down. And these facts and this data precedes COVID. So we need to actually look at what is happening. So there's a 1 in 2,150 chance of being convicted as a perpetrator. And when you work out UK statistics with the Walk Free Foundation Globally Slavery Index and Justice and Cares data estimating the numbers in the UK are over 100,000, with 67 prosecutions last year, we're not far off that number, because those 67 prosecutions will not result in 67 convictions. Furthermore, there were 30 risk orders used last year. We have 46 police forces across the UK. One doesn't have risk orders, but the others do. So pro rata, we haven't even reached 1 per police force area. But what can communities do? What can we do internationally? Well, I've worked with religious sisters and communities when I was a police officer who helped us in investigations, reached out to people in need, but also, importantly, helped us with victims. And we've heard about the Sustainable Development Goals and what their aim and ambition is. But when we look at this, we are talking about serious and organised crime, but we're also talking about human rights violations. And are we understanding it for what it is? Are we actually responding in a way that challenges those issues? Whether that's the car washes, whether that's in the factories in Leicestershire, whether that's in the cocoa fields, of the Ivory Coast, or as we've heard about, the mica in India. And of course, we're seeing babies sold, we're seeing organs sold. So we need everybody involved, from justice, labour inspectorates, unions, health, local authorities, including education, transport, business and trade, and importantly, the driver for this can be civil society. We've heard about cobalt earlier, and that is powering the very things that we are using now, phones or laptops. And the demand for that could never be greater. But children are dying in these situations. It's estimated 22,000 children die a year in exploitative labour conditions. We need to think of that number. When 2 aircraft crashed, tragically, the whole fleet of Boeing 737 MAX was grounded. 300 lives lost. Absolutely shocking. But that cost the industry billions, and the action and reaction was incredible. Who is speaking out for these 22,000 children? Yet people are making money. So we need to think about what we can do. We need to know what the issues are. We need to be able to come up with solutions, and we need to reset the moral compass. So the way that I'm looking at doing this is we need to start looking at the international level. We need to look at demanding that supply chains are free of modern slavery, as we've heard about. We also need to make sure that government's procurement isn't ending up in the hands of slave masters. The G20 is committed to this, and so we need to make sure that they are doing what they're saying. We also need to make sure that the internet, through legislation, is free of modern slavery. That can be achieved. It's very easy to do, as we've seen on other things. But we need to make sure that the businesses who run these actually are mandated to do that. We can also create this notion, which I want to see, of tainted money. If we see incidents that have happened in the UK recently, the big companies walk away scot-free. We may see the trafficker go to prison. We may see some monies seized. But actually, it's the companies who should be making sure of that. If you run a business and your fire exit is locked, you're responsible as chief executive. If you run a business and you have an illegal immigrant in your building, albeit that you've taken all the measures to prevent it, you can get an instant fine of £10,000. So why is it when you've got somebody who is actually creating revenue for you, you face no sanction? So I want to see tainted money, which is a lot further than actually proceeds of crime, or as we understand it in my world as a police officer, the crime, the money that is directly identified from the criminal activity. But we need to see UN agencies. We need to see the legislation and the rules we've got in the UN agencies updated. The 1936 Slavery Convention didn't think about the internet, didn't think about flights, didn't think about globalization. We need to make sure that they are rewritten, not rewritten as in a new convention, but their terminology is current. And we also need to make sure that international agencies are responding to this. I'm working closely with the International Council of Nursing, part of the World Health Organization, representing 27 million nurses around the world. We're looking at what the World Food Programme can do. Where does the World Bank sit on this? All of these things that connect to this, if you look at legislation in the US that actually provides a possibility and is used frequently to prevent companies trading in the US if there is slavery in their supply chain. That means that they might not be able to get loans or get any sort of business with the US or with other countries. So we need to start looking at what is available internationally and using it effectively. But also, and importantly, we need to reset the moral compass. And that's where faith comes in. I was lucky when I was commissioner to have Bishop Alastair Redfern as my chair of my board, and he still holds that position. He was my moral compass, somebody I could go to and ask those questions. Am I doing right? Am I doing wrong? What should we do? So we all need somebody to help us to set that moral compass, but it's up to us to find that person who can help us set our moral compass and be our mentor and our guide through that journey. Us as Christians, we've got that, but we need to use it. And if we do this properly, we have got a chance of achieving SDG 8.7 by 2030 by eradicating the model of modern slavery that exists, not just within the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom, but actually globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin Highland. Now I'm just going to give you a brief reminder, if any of you are unfamiliar with the difference between the chat and the Q&A on the bottom of your screen, the scroll bar with the icons. If you want to ask a question, we have got a number, as we've said, we've submitted, but particularly if you want to comment on something you've heard, we've got 45 minutes now exactly until we end. Please write your comment or your question in the Q&A, not in the chat. And I'm going to kick off straight away with a question from Sally Thomas, who asks, when we have our suspicions and we try to engage in supportive and appropriate conversations to get to know people and find out more, how do we do this when we often don't share a common language with the person that we're meeting? They might only speak Romanian or Arabic or whatever. So does anyone want to go with that one? I'm particularly thinking maybe we start with you, Kevin, because you'll probably have most experience of this.
Yes, thank you, Julia. And, this is a really good question because when I was a serving police officer, I would say a large majority of the people we dealt with who were victims didn't speak English or had difficulty with English or didn't want to speak to a police officer. And I think the example I gave there of working with religious sisters or with people in civil society, first of all, when we would go on operations, we would do the intelligence checking to see who the people were going to be or the chances. So we would have people with the language skills. But when you've got people from civil society with you, and particularly from faith groups, the amount of languages you can access is incredible. And if you have a network where you know you're going to meet a Romanian, you may be able to seek out of your network someone who can speak Romanian. And we have technology like we are now that can actually enable that. So we're not using what is available to us in a positive way. And I come from a background of law enforcement where there'll be rules and regulations and everything is jumping through hoops for obvious reasons around transparency and other things around law. But civil society isn't limited in the same way. And civil society and faith groups need to take that back and realize that people like me, when I was a police officer and when I was the anti-slavery commissioner, I worked for you. I didn't work for someone else, or I didn't work the other way around. And I think that's something that needs to be empowered to people. But the network will have access to incredible amounts of language skills, cultural knowledge, and it's just about finding it, logging it, and when you need to use it, having this network that can access it almost instantly. And then you will start to see some real change, some trust building. And I've seen that happen time and time again, not just in the United Kingdom. I've seen some incredible projects in places like India, where we have schools that have been set up by Christian religious people, and they are educating Muslims, and the Muslims then fund those. The interfaith commitment on this is incredible. So I think we shouldn't miss an opportunity, and I think all the asset is within your own organizations and networks.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have anything burning to add to that from your experience? Or just wave to me if you do. At any point, the panelists. Christine.
I serve on the Multi-Faith Advisory Council for the United Nations, and we just had a meeting of our Gender Equality Committee. Can I suggest that even looking at our own nations and what we would call a diaspora, that as we are solving a practical problem of translation or language, we're actually building a movement. So practical issues become more inclusive in building this movement. We've relaunched our World Evangelical Alliance website this week. On that website, we have decided we want the Spanish language. Why have we decided that? Because we're starting a movement of collaboration, of networking with faith communities in South America and Central America. So a practical need is not a problem. It's an opportunity of inclusivity. And also, when we think of the way our world is structured with diaspora, India has more trafficking than anywhere. We can appeal in my nation to people of India to create and hold that influence. So it's finding ways to interact and build that unified way of thinking and relating. There are unmet relationships up there, and it could be even about language translation.
Thank you. I'd like to come to Bishop Alastair with a question. I think you mentioned it actually, Bishop. What do you think? You said you think things are much worse because of COVID-19. What in your experience have you picked up in the Clure initiative, if anything, through these last 6 months? And have you thought of any new ways that you could start to tackle things that are, as you said, hidden and invisible?
Well, just two examples really, that a couple of levels. There's an enormous increase, and we see it gathering at the moment, about homeless people and people who are very vulnerable and insecure and anxious. And they are the perfect people to be recruited with the offer of a job that turns into becoming enslaved. And there are more and more British nationals getting drawn into modern slavery in our country. In the run up to Christmas, many of us will be involved with schemes for the homeless and food banks and night shelters and hot food points. And that's where the recruiters go to find people. And it's very important that we try and raise the awareness of all these good Christian people to look out for this, to try and protect people, to try and equip them to say no to the cheap offer, really. Begging is exploding, and most beggars, Christians, are the first people to give somebody £1 because then you can walk by and think you've done all right. In fact, they won't get that £1 almost certainly. There's a gang running them. They're kept in this disabled state. You'll notice they have in front of them now a half-eaten sandwich and a coffee which says, don't give us money, don't give us goods, we want money. That's the business model. So there's, each of us can just be more aware of what's happening around us in our communities. But I think the big thing is that we're trying to do a lot of work in building what we call community resilience, inviting people of goodwill, often using church halls, to gather. And Clure, for instance, we do a short course where you can learn to open your eyes about what's happening in your community, who are your allies to try and care for each other, and how do you equip the vulnerable to say no when people come knocking. I think we've got to get ahead and equip our church communities and people of goodwill to notice and to empower people who are vulnerable to know they're loved and cared for, and they have support and somewhere to go and people to talk to, and not just be on their own and vulnerable, really. So there's just two micro and macro examples.
That's great, thank you. And Pam, I don't know if you can pick up any of this from your particular experience with the Soroptimists over the past 6 months. And you need to unmute. Oh, you are unmuted.
Only to say really that because we cannot find out where these people are in terms of those who are being trafficked into this country, and I appreciate that there's you don't give out people's names and addresses willy-nilly. I don't mean that, but there is this continued secrecy, so you can't go out and help. You can't take a package, as Bishop Alastair said earlier, you know, to welcome somebody. There has to be a way in which those organisations who are responsible with the NRM to allow those of us who want to help, whether it's the church or whoever, that can be done, because it's not good enough, basically. I don't know that it was very helpful, but sorry.
No, actually, I think you were really helpful, and you actually struck on exactly one of the questions that someone has submitted, not committed, which was very much this: when the victims are in places of safety, which are secret and confidential, how can we as church communities or civil society NGOs reach out to them and invite them to say activities that the church might be doing, like literacy classes or whatever. And I think this is probably one of the relationship gaps that we were talking about before we came onto the call, those of us who are involved in planning. And I don't know if anyone, Alastair, yes, I was going to ask you if you could pick up on this one, please, because it sounds like it's your kind of area.
Well, no, I'd like to pick up on Kevin in his wonderful overview. He's got this tremendous international experience, but he talked about people are lost in a system. So in fact, there's no system. And I think that's what Pam is putting her finger on. And therefore, if the systems aren't working, it's very difficult for them to relate to us, because you know, we find, for instance, working with local authorities, people change jobs and all the wisdom they had about slavery disappears, really, and the next person doesn't know anything about it. If the systems aren't working, as Kevin, I think, quite rightly says, then our task is how are we going to build, first of all, informal systems. The welfare state came out of a lot of charity work that the churches did in the 19th century, really. How can we build micro systems, build them up, and show models to the government and to the local authority and things of how we can care, how we can reach out, how we can gather resources, and all that. That seems a shame when we've got all these sophisticated systems. I think Kevin's absolutely right. They're not delivering. And do we put our energies into trying to help the systems with all the constraints on them? Or do we try and challenge them by saying, look, this is possible and that's possible? I'll be very interested to hear what Kevin says about that, but I think he's put his finger on the key thing.
Yeah, thank you, Bishop Alastair. And I think between us all, we're kind of identifying what the big challenge is. And, you know, this isn't a blame game. This is identifying where the problem is, because at the end of it, there's somebody who is vulnerable and being lost. But if you look at the way modern slavery and the national referral mechanism is managed, you know, it's all centralized. The NRM is done remotely from, say, you in Wales, or, you know, whichever county in Wales you're in. Well, there's nothing else that is done like that, particularly on policing. Yes, things like counterterrorism are centralized for information and intelligence, but actually each police force has to have its own response that has to be effective, you know, no matter where you are in the UK. So when a victim is found, there'll be all these kind of things, like, as Pam says, cloaking it in data protection or secrecy. Well, we don't do that about other crime that happens that involves a victim of vulnerability. In fact, if you're going to get your risk orders, or you're going to catch your criminals, or you're going to find other victims in the area, you need to engage the public. That's the way British policing works, and it's policing by consent. So we really need to understand that. But then a victim may be found in Wales and then is moved to somewhere else in the country, and the crime may have happened elsewhere, and there is no link up, there is no response. Now that is getting better, but clearly it's not good enough if there's only 67 prosecutions in a whole year. So, you know, as Pam said, and as Bishop Joanna said, the information is in a system. And when I was looking at the issue of Vietnamese, when I was commissioner, we went, and one of my team examined all the data that was in the system, sat on desks, and we found all this information that was there, but wasn't being mined. So it's all there somewhere, but it needs to be held locally, because when it comes together in this big mass, it is too difficult to work out. Yes, locally they can react and respond and hold responsibility as a local authority, a police force, about what's going on. And of course the information, just like other crimes, gets centralized so you can see the bigger picture for the National Crime Agency to respond to. But what's happening at the moment is it's going into a system in the Home Office, then perhaps going to the National Crime Agency, perhaps going back to police. Then you've got the NRM that's separate. Nobody knows where the victims are. They're moved around. That is not a system. And if we had that about going to see our doctor, or we had that about reporting a burglary, or if you went into a police station and you said, I've been the victim of an assault, and they said, well, you've got to ring this number, someone remotely in the Home Office got to make a decision, and then we'll come back to you in a year's time, there'd be outrage. So we should be outraged by this.
So is it a question, again, coming back, that in a sense, because so many of us are not affected in terms of people who maybe are influential, then it remains something that people are not putting to the top of their priority list? Or is it now, as everyone's saying, in the time of COVID, there's a chance to re-engineer, reimagine? Is that what we need to be doing, do you think, with this so-called system? Kevin, I'm asking you because you seem to have most experience of it.
Yes, exactly, Julia, and starting to call the system to account, because it is something that is owned by communities. The system is owned by communities in a democracy. That's a great thing about the United Kingdom. But I also think, you know, when I was speaking at the Security Council at the UN, the Secretary General of the UN was there, and he actually opened his speech saying, when I had my children were younger and teenagers, I was really concerned that they would actually get involved in drugs, or someone might actually lure them with drugs. So I was concerned about that. And he was the former Prime Minister of Portugal. He said, but I didn't think that my children would ever be involved in modern slavery. And he said, and I think most of us feel like that. So it's not our concern. It's not our real concern. And that's something we need to change. And we need to get, you know, the spirit of someone like William Wilberforce. He came up against massive resistance from Parliament. He was told he was going to bring down the British Empire because this was the economy. This was essential. Well, this collaboration, which the church can lead on, actually has to have his resolve, but making sure that the systems work for the people that are currently identified. The systems pursue the criminals. But as we've heard from Christine, we need to really look at prevention. And that is about making this non-financially viable, something that you don't dare do. And if you do dare do it, you're going to get the whole, you know, infrastructure of law and order, the whole public outrage. But if you're running a business in the UK at the moment, and you have dozens of people working in modern slavery, you can then do some project, work with some organization, and then get the tick box. We need to turn it to say, if it's in your business, if it's in your house, well, you need to have some accountability.
I'd like to, yes, I was going to say, I'd like to bring you in here, Christine. So that's great that you put your hand up.
The word system is interesting because it suggests a very concrete focus on dealing with a situation. The Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them as put out by the United Nations, are talking now about those goals not being isolated in and of themselves. So the trafficking goal is very often linked to other goals. And the problem with systems is that we miss out on the contributing factors to something like trafficking. If you look at COVID right now, what it's really beginning to address and what's surfacing is economic injustice. It's people in many countries who work daily for daily food. And that then is creating a real flavor for trafficking victims because they're literally starving to death. And people are saying, we won't die of COVID-19, we'll die of hunger. In India, I was just on a call this week with our lawyer on our task force from India. Trafficking is being linked into religious persecution. So people who become of another faith persuasion are being punished through trafficking. And the lockdown of COVID-19 has victims then without access to food. It has workers on the front lines not able to travel. And we begin to see that as we create a system, traffickers will try and outdo it. And so we need to be flexible. We need to be light on our feet. We need to be so aware. And that's why I'm talking about this collaborative table that sees things from different angles. And my fear is we think we can capture this with one bold system. It takes everybody. I'm not going to talk about Wales or the UK. I'm going to talk about an approach to how this thing can work.
Thank you very much. I want to bring in a couple of comments here. To be fair, we've had a comment from Brave Bear in Cardiff, who says, we have a very different experience in South Wales. We have a befriending scheme, and those who are doing the NRM referrals work with us to pair them up. We reach out every week. We do English classes, sport, food, training and education. In Cardiff, it's a joy of a partnership. So clearly they're getting something right, and it is working there. And maybe some on this call need to pick up with Brave Bear and get some practical experience from them. And there's also another comment from Peter, who writes, unfortunately, perhaps the narrative is being controlled by historical slavery rather than modern slavery. People are more offended by a statue rather than getting their car washed cheaply. And I want to come in on that point of car wash and getting things cheap. I think, Pam, you talked about this quite a bit. And I want to bring it back to the sort of particular, because some of us can get a bit lost with thinking, oh, you know, it's all about these massive, complex, you know, changing administration and government and civil society kind of legislation and all of that. What do I do at my level? One thing is I don't go and buy cheap t-shirts, maybe. I don't have a mobile phone. That's probably a stretch too far for most people. But Pam, I want to come back to you, and you talked about writing those letters and finding out what the supply chains were behind some of the goods and the services that we purchase ourselves. Tell us a little bit about what you found out when you started getting information from your letters.
I think it was, I'm going to have to go on another screen when I look for the answers to that, but I won't share it.
Just talk from your off the top of your head, if you like, rather than worry too much.
Right, okay.
Figures.
People wrote to places like the Co-op, Tesco's, all our high street stores. And a lovely lady who has the same way of dealing with things that I was brought up to do. You don't talk to the lower management, you go to the top. So she wrote to the chief executive officers of the Co-op and Tesco's, etc. And their replies were interesting. In some ways, it is lonely at the top. And there is a tendency that you are not told what's going on in your organisation. And at times, some replies gave that impression that those at the top didn't quite know what happened in their downline, into their
supply chains.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not quoting any of those people as having, but those things are going on, and it's up to us as consumers to make the effort to go and buy something by all means, but then to find out, well, is this really okay? Is it where it's coming from? Is that the people who are doing the job? Are they paid the right money? Are they in the right sort of conditions? We've hidden away from the realities of life for people who provide things for us for too long. And I think we just have to be responsible, and if we can, get on the internet, do your research. Anybody can do that. Foodstuffs and things tell us where they are collected, harvested. So, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to another question that we've had in advance, which I think I'm going to come to Kevin for this one. Somebody asks, in my local town, there are a few women who seem to be living in situations of abuse, informal brothels, etc. They seem either too frightened of their pimps or the authorities to want to get out. I don't want to call the police if it makes their situation worse because they are foreign and possibly illegal. What can I do to help them?
So that is a challenge, but I've seen projects run around the UK that actually deal with that very situation. And yes, it's not just about, as the question says, it's not about just going in and calling the police and calling this one. I mean, the first thing you have to do with someone in those situations, and that could be included a car wash, that could include someone in a nail bar, if they're not ready to step out at that moment, then you may want to give them that companionship. And there is a great project in London, that's what it does. It acts as a companionship for these people, sees them in a safe place, accesses them when they're not in that situation, and then actually says to them, you come to us and we will make sure that you are well, that your health is taken care of, that you are living. And during that period, and sometimes it can take months, that they then convince them to step out. And that's when the NRM should come in, because the NRM is not actually conditional to assist in the authorities. And once the person understands that, perhaps then they'll step out. But we do have this problem, as you say, with immigration. And, you know, across the world, we've got 70 million people displaced. And that was something I looked at in my time as commissioner. And there are criminals, you know, living off this. And we now see across the channel, there are brokers actually working in northern France, selling jobs before people take these dangerous crossings across the, you know, the channel and end up in the UK. But at the end of it, we need to remember these are people. So it goes back as well, who's got the languages, who's got the cultural knowledge, find that, find who can help you with that, try and identify what nationality they are, and then find a common point. And I can tell you something about a Catholic bishop, what he did. He knew that the people in the car washes wouldn't come to him, but he believed that some of them were Eastern European and from Catholic or Christian backgrounds. So he would drive in there and he would have rosary beads in the car. And some people asked for them and he just gave them out. And then he got to know them and he would just say, if you need help, come and see us. Now, through that same relationship, I, as a police officer, was asked to go to a meeting with the Filipino embassy, and there was a guarantee that came from the church that I wouldn't be looking at immigration status. And they said they had some trafficked people. I thought it might be 1, 2, or 3. I turned up to the meeting, there were 67 exploited Filipino nationals in this room. And we were able to eventually support them all through lawyers. Most of them have been duped. Some wanted to go home, some wanted to return to education, and we brought down the criminal network, not just in the UK, but also in the Philippines. And we did the first assets recovery under the new Filipino law that just come in. All this is possible. Where there's a will, there's a way. And the Santa Marta group, just to finalize, which is now headed by the Pope, has got 35 plus countries involved in it. Bishop Alastair has been involved in it since the outset. That is now an international network, which the Pope launched and it partakes in every year. It brings together also people of good faith, people of civil society, politicians from around the world coming up with solutions. That whole network started from a presentation in a church hall in North London and is now a global network. That is actually the ability of faith groups and what can be achieved by civil society and people coming together in a trusted environment.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you. Now, I'm also going to pick up another point, though, that is the next practical point following on from what you've just been saying, which is that I'm going to put this one to you, Alastair, if I may. Some local groups have offered facilities, e.g. reception centres and accommodation, which have not been taken up, even after working with the police and others on developing the provision. How can partnership working be improved to prevent that happening again? Alastair.
Okay, well, I think part of it is we can get organised to, you know, I've been with groups that have found a safe house to make it available. One of the points Kevin has been making is there's a very low level of detection. And we mustn't get, we can put our energies in the wrong place in a way. We can try and put these systems and then there aren't people to come and benefit. So when we're engaging with partners, we have to work very carefully about what is the presenting problem that we're starting from. And I think what the church can contribute, we have this convening power. The great thing we bring is people generally think we're on the side of goodness, despite all the scandals. They generally think we're on the side of goodness, but they know we're not expert. And therefore, we genuinely need the expertise of other people, police, local authority, NGOs, whatever it is, to bring the picture together, as Christine was saying. And I think we've got to be bolder at inviting these different perspectives into the space. And before we set off on doing projects, we've got to do the kind of analysis that says, in this space that we're living in, and the local has become much more important in COVID for people in this space, what are the police struggling with? What are the local authorities struggling with? What are NGOs trying to achieve? And the church can kind of hold the ring in a kind of holy innocence of not knowing all the details of that, but bringing them together because we all want good things to happen. A friend of Kevin and mine, Bishop Sanchez, who's a great player in the Santa Marta group, talks about the Beatitudes are in every human heart. You don't have to be a Christian to get what, you know, blessed are the poor, those who mourn. Our hearts reach out. The church has got to gather people in that spirit and let other people provide the expertise, and then we can come in behind and try and add value where we can.
I'm going to throw a question to you, Joanna, because are you okay to come in and join us, Joanna? I would like to ask a question that's come in beforehand, and you may not be the best person, but they're asking what is being done at government level in Wales and Westminster to tackle some of these issues. There seems to be so much around awareness raising, but not much about how to stop all this in the first place. And I wonder, with your overview from Wales, you could comment on that. What is being done at government levels?
I have to say that I'm not the best person to answer this question. So I shan't waffle and pretend that I am. I'll pass over. I have some comments to make, but I don't have the expertise on knowing exactly what's going on in the Welsh situation. Maybe you know, somebody could comment. But I was really heartened by Brave Bear's comment. So obviously there are places in Wales where this is happening. And I have to say that from a Welsh perspective, I do have confidence in our government structures and our Welsh government structures in a way that I don't have as a British citizen in our UK Westminster government. And I'm sure if I were in England, I wouldn't have confidence in my local systems there. So I think there probably is good news, but I'm not the expert. I don't know the details.
That's fine. Thank you very much. So in that case, I'm going to come to you, Kevin, again. And one comment that we've had, short-term funding seems to be a characteristic of this work, at least from our experience in Wales. The person who asked this question quoted, e.g. Crime Stoppers had a schools worker in North Wales, the Children's Society had a worker based with South Wales Police, but both were short-term projects. What can we do to ensure consistent work and funding is a priority?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because what's happening is that we are looking at this in project-based when it should be integrated into everything. You know, the list of people that I said should be engaged in this should be at policy level, all working together. You know, we don't hope that when we phone the 999 for something that, you know, if it's a fire engine we need, we don't phone the other side of the country and hope that a fire engine turns up. We know that the system will work. If we go to the A&E somewhere, we know that the system will work, because we arrive and there's a process and we understand it. But with modern slavery, we've gone through this process for a long time now, you know, for years, for a decade, where it's been project-based, instead of planting it into the systems that need to respond, so that, you know, every police officer, every healthcare worker, every school teacher has this integrated into their daily business. And then you start to see people understanding and questioning the system or what the process is. If you don't know what it should look like, how can you actually change it, or how can you have influence? Just going back to the other issue that was raised, you know, in Wales, you have had a coordinator for a long time. You've got people doing things. So there's a lot going on in Wales, and there is accountability. But we need to move on from just awareness raising to actually what is the hard outcomes we want to see. And I think sometimes, you know, looking at it from a slightly different way, if we look at, you know, someone like Frederick Douglass, who was escaped slavery back in the transatlantic slave trade from the US, and he did a speech and he became, you know, a nominee for vice president in the US. He then actually went on to be the Marshal of Washington, DC. But he gave a speech about the fact that, you know, July the 4th, and celebrating independence in the United States. And he gave this speech where he said, what are you celebrating? What is it you are celebrating at the moment? We haven't got freedom in our country, and you are celebrating. And I think we need to start to understand that with modern slavery. We have a lot of celebration, we have a lot of backslapping, but actually there are millions and millions and hundreds of thousands potentially in the UK who are exploited. So there's no space at the moment for backslapping. And just also to pull on something that Pope Francis said at the first Santa Marta group, he said, to understand this, the world needs to lament, we need to cry, we need to shed many tears to understand this. And when I look back to incidents like when Alan Kurdi, the 4-year-old that was washed up on the beach in Turkey, we saw outcries from David Cameron, from Enda Kenny from Ireland, from Erdogan from Turkey. We saw the Australian Prime Minister, the New Zealand Prime Minister, all actually outcrying about this incident and saying we need to check this, we need to stop this. And Erdogan, the president of Turkey, said humanity has sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Well, where are those tears now about the 70 million who are displaced, about the 40 million in trafficking? What did those statements they made then change? It's rhetoric, and we need to start calling it out and saying you signed all these commitments at UN and at national level, and we now need to see them delivered. So until people feel it as a tear, until people feel it, this is really hitting me in the stomach, like we do when we see other violent and serious crime, perhaps rape, domestic violence, murder, we need to look at this in the same vein, because then we will start to understand it, respond to it, and actually start to say to our organisations and authorities, you need to do your bit.
Thank you. Bishop Alastair, you wanted to come in.
Just also picking up the thing about what can government do and what is it doing in Wales or in the UK. I'm not particularly expert in Wales, I may need correcting, but I was on a group that reviewed the Modern Slavery Act after 3 years. And one of the recommendations was that Kevin mentioned companies over a certain size have to produce a modern slavery statement to show that they're, trying to police their supply chains. One thing we recommended that I think is now going to be put into place is that public authorities also do this, provide a statement about their practices to look at supply chains. Now, if that happens, every local authority has a huge business, and if it does it properly, you think of all the local businesses that go down the supply chain in any community through the work of the local authority. That gives us a chance as voters, citizens, to lobby councillors to say, we want something with teeth that will work, that's measurable, that can reassure us. So that's the way to get it into local economies. As I say, I'm not sure whether the Welsh Assembly will do the same or who it's for, but we're going in that direction. The second thing is that something that CLUA is preparing for is that next May will be the elections for the police and crime commissioners. They were delayed. And I think there needs to be a massive campaign in the spring before the election to ask all candidates about this issue. Because police and crime commissioners have quite big budgets, they have a lot of levers, and we need to get the people who are standing, of whatever party, to commit on this issue and to have the kind of passion that Kevin was talking about. And that's a simple way of us saying to people who need our votes, really, this is a priority in our hearts. We want you to be able to make a promise that if you're elected, this is what you're up for.
Great, thank you very much. I don't know if you've all seen, I know I'm watching the clock here, we've got a couple of minutes and I want to bring Christine in, but I also want to draw your attention, in case you haven't seen it, a comment from Mark Isherwood, who is a member of the Welsh Government. And he says, I want to signpost people to Borso and WWA. I hope I'm pronouncing those two rightly. And he's going to highlight a meeting with Kevin that he's arranged in the Senate next month. And he's going to question Kevin following our meeting over coffee last year regarding data, ports and domestic patterns of trafficking. So thank you very much, Mark. Sorry we couldn't bring you in person on that one. But I'm going to come back to Christine, and then I think I'm going to call it to a halt on the discussion, and I'm going to hand back to Bishop Joanna very shortly. But Christine first.
Can I suggest we just put the mirror on ourselves? I was involved in a call last week on climate change. Serve on a board with Tier Fund. And there's a national leader who is against climate change. And 80% of the Christians in his nation, and this is not the US, by the way, are all for him. But when they were asked, is caring for God's world important? They all said yes. And if we don't, it's a sin. And I'm suggesting we have this disconnect, even in our faith communities, about what we immediately go for in judgment and what our conscience has not allowed us to really see. And in Canada, I know that the parliamentary way in which we promoted new laws was through a Christian woman named Joy Smith. And she struggled desperately to get parliamentarians to believe her that a new law was needed. And she brought in victims of trafficking, and they spoke and they told their stories. And that's what convinced the parliamentarians that we need a new law. So my suggestion is that we don't only create these systems, we don't become advocates, but what does it mean for the church and all its viability to have a conscience on this issue? And my suggestion is, if there are 2 billion Christians in the world, that's a lot of conscience. And so it could be there's a disconnect between our desire and the movement that we're lending ourselves to.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, before I hand to Bishop Joanna, I just want to mention that Ali Usuri, who I think has been probably in touch with many of you, wants to keep in touch on all this with a follow-up email. So if you would like to continue this discussion, please make sure that you're in contact with Ali and she will send you a follow-up email. And now, Bishop Joanna, and thank you very much to all of you for the question and answers today.
Again, I'd like to add my thanks to all the participants today for their great words and encouragement. I'd like to draw attention to Caroline Adams, that says that Wales has an ethical employment in supply chains code of practice, which applies to all government suppliers, which is very heartening. I think I'd like to go to Bishop Redfern's question, we see you. And I think, although there has been so many encouraging things, the problems are opportunities, collaboration at the table, the inspiring words that we've heard from Pam about local people taking action and making things different. But I think one of the things that will come across to me is our joint complicity. And I want to pick up on Julia saying, I do not have a mobile phone. And until we as consumers are prepared to act with our consciences, not at the soft level of writing letters, as important as that is, but unless we are prepared to take the hit, then this will continue. Because what we really need to undercut is the fact that it is still profitable. And whatever governments do, it remains profitable. And until we're prepared to bite the bullet and actually vote with our pockets, we will be in a mess. So I really think it is up to us as Christians and as people of whatever faith or none of good conscience to actually have the courage of our convictions. The Church in Wales is thinking about disinvesting in companies that have cobalt mining in their portfolio. But none of us have suggested that we give up the mobile phones with which all our people communicate. And until we're prepared to do that, I think this will carry on. Thank you very much indeed for listening and for all those who have taken part. And I pray that God will enable us to stand forth, to be heard and to see and to speak about what we see until one day our world might be free of this scandal.
Thank you very much to everyone for taking part, and we wish you well in the future in your endeavours in this area, and thank you for everything you're already doing. Goodbye.
Okay, the attendees are now leaving. I'm going to stop the recording at this point, so thank you all. I'm going to stop recording now.